I was asked to focus my section on why it's important to have this debate. And I think the first answer to that question is, to put it quite bluntly, because economic and especially fiscal policy have been governed by what is essentially a lie for the last 5 years. And this lie is that the deficit is due to overspending on public services and that it needs to be tackled through a programme of austerity. So it's an attitude or an idea that has been termed deficit fetishism by Simon Wren-Lewis, and it's also often captured in terms of the nation as family metaphor. So the idea that, like a household, we as a country need to tighten our belts and to start living within our means. Now, this has been the central message of the Tories since 2010, but it's based on bad economics. Most fundamentally because the UK government, unlike a household, can borrow from itself. So what matters to debt sustainability in a country with its own currency is the ratio of GDP growth to interest rate. And if growth is higher than interest payments, we can manage permanent indebtedness. It is true that under certain circumstances, debt may crowd out private investment or create inflationary pressures. But in the present circumstances, where the economy is operating below capacity, we're still really trying to break free from the long recession. These are not prime concerns or even concerns at all right now. And in addition to that, perhaps even more important than the kind of false fears around government debt that fiscal fetishism or deficit fetishism has created, is that it rules out the current policy or the current approach to the deficit and austerity in general, rules out a role for fiscal policy in managing levels of aggregate demand in the economy or in expanding the capacity of the economy in the long term. So in short, in economic terms, austerity is a poorly conceived policy. My view is that what austerity is really about is reassuring creditors, the financial sector, that their needs will be put above those of citizens under any circumstances, really. We're always going to prioritise paying back the debt to the financial sector, to creditors, than we are to meet the needs of social and other needs of citizens. Yet despite it being bad economics, up until recently, Labour haven't really done a serious job of challenging austerity. We saw under Miliband a kind of austerity light, which accepted the basic premises of deficit fetishism and of austerity. So for me, a key aspect of the significance of Corbynomics is that it's finally challenging this deficit fetishism. Now, the precise nature of the challenge is still, I think, very much being clarified. I think it's important to remember that Corbynomics, like Donald Dewar once said of devolution, is a process, not an event. So we saw a lot of attention being put on people's quantitative easing during Corbyn's campaign for leader. But more recently, this proposal seems to have receded from view a little bit. And perhaps, as Jonathan touched on, in recognition that in the present context, it actually makes much more sense for investment to be financed by conventional borrowing because interest rates are so low. So more recently, policy debates within kind of the Corbyn camp have been dominated by prevarications around the fiscal charter that it was eventually not signed up to. But there's still some ambiguity, I think, as to McDonnell's stance on balancing the budget. So he's indicated at times that he's committed to balancing the current but not the capital account, i.e. you can borrow only to invest but not for current spending, or that it's committed to balancing the budget over the cycle. Now, my personal view is that economically speaking, both positions are problematic. This is partly because it accepts the premises that deficits are a problem, which is not true. It also comes with the implication that in an economic downturn, if expenditures on, say, benefits start to exceed income, they need to be cut, which is very problematic, especially when considered in the context of Corbyn's pledge that the poor will no longer pay for the deficit under a Labour government. There are also problems with the particular variants of budget balancing that McDonnell has indicated he might be committed to so far. So the borrow only to invest approach, for example, suffers from the problem that the distinction between current and capital expenditure is far from black and white in practice. So the spending on, for example, doctors and nurses and teachers' wages counts as current expenditure, but as they're spending on health and education, I think it's reasonable to assume that they expand the productive capacity of the economy in the long run. Similarly, the commitment to balance the budget over the cycle position has several problems, but a fundamental one is how do we define the cycle in practice? I think the idea of an economic cycle is a concept that is empirically very problematic. So there are issues still. The precise nature of the alternative being offered by Corbyn and Corbynomics is still being ironed out. And I think what we're seeing in this ironing out process is the juggling of economic arguments on the one hand with considerations that pertain more to political strategy on the other. So, for example, I think people's quantitative easing was given weight initially because Corbyn wanted to make the argument that, for political reasons, that it's possible to reduce the public deficit while still investing in infrastructure. So it's a reasonable political objective, even though, as both Jonathan and I have suggested, it doesn't actually make sense given how low interest rates are at the moment. Similarly, I think the early position on the fiscal charter was driven at least in part by a concern to make Labour look economically responsible. So, i.e. political considerations rather than economic ones. And I expect as we go forward, political strategy will continue to be juggled with economic arguments. I suspect most other signatories to the letter to the Observer hope that Corbyn's team will become bolder in their economic arguments, but it remains to see how it plays out. The key point is that it's safe to say that there is now much more space for good economic arguments to be made in the public and political domain than there were before Corbyn became leader of the Labour Party. And this, for me, is the first reason that this debate matters. Corbyn's ascension to leader has created the space to improve the standard of public economic debate by considering these issues and by challenging, seriously, deficit fetishism. However, I also think that the significance of Corbynomics goes much further, or is much broader than this opening up of the debate about fiscal policy. So one of the pernicious effects of deficit fetishism has been to focus attention on the deficit and debt as the economic problems, rather than the many other issues confronting Britain's economy. So these include weak exports and the deficit on the balance of payments current account, weak productivity and wage growth, relatively poor business investment, a manufacturing sector that struggles to compete despite some areas of strength, dependence on debt-fueled consumer demand, which is in turn sustained by volatile housing sector, gross regional imbalances, so on and so forth. There are many, many problems with the British economy that the focus on debt and the deficit doesn't acknowledge at all. My view is that Britain's over-dependence on the financial sector is at root of many of these problems, and that the broader significance of Corbynomics lies in the extent to which it is challenging this. So the economic lie that underpins deficit fetishism has a political counterpart in the story that the deficit was caused by Labour's profligacy. I think most people in this room will acknowledge that the bulk of the deficit was actually caused by Brown's bailout of the banks and fiscal injection in the midst of the 2007-9 financial crisis, which were both celebrated at the time as saving the economy. And in the years leading into the financial crisis, it was actually private rather than public debt that was growing more dramatically. And this reflects our ultra-financialised private sector, in which the private sector spends much more on financial trading generally than it does on R&D or capital formation. So Adair Turner estimates that the UK banking system lends approximately 15% of total lending by the UK banking system is for capital investment, with the rest funding consumption or the purchase of existing assets, particularly housing or the land that housing sits on. Now, the channeling of credit in this way creates asset price bubbles, which, as we saw in the financial crisis, can have disastrous effects when they burst. So while financial liberalisation that we've emerged from the 1980s or even late 1970s led to some growth in the 1990s and the early 2000s, it left in its wake a devastated banking sector, a highly indebted household sector, and an uncompetitive industrial sector, which is suffering from years of underinvestment in its productive capacity. So what the economy desperately needs is for debt to be directed away from consumption, especially housing, and towards production, in order to expand our productive capacity. But until now, or until Corbyn at least, both the Tories and New Labour have been absolutely complicit in the status quo. So on both sides, really, the response to the financial crisis was more or less to say to the financial sector, stop taking the piss, but otherwise carry on as you were. But as in the realm of fiscal policy, with Corbynomics we see the beginning of a challenge to this consensus. Indeed, I think it's possible to argue that the defining idea of Corbynomics, which runs right through everything he's proposing, is that it's time to give up on financial assets and to start investing in stuff again. Again, as with fiscal policy, we're waiting to see how this is fleshed out and how successful it will be. There are good signs, so he's talking about industrial strategy. He's appointed Mariana Mazzucato to his Economic Advisory Board, and this is significant because, again, as Jonathan mentioned, she's done very, very serious and important work elaborating the central role played by the state in technological progress. And I think this area, I'm summing up now, the final point. This area has the potential to lead to very, very dramatic changes. You know, if Corbyn is serious about transforming the structure and underlying productivity of the UK economy, it will require a radical rethinking of the relationship between the state and the private sector. And this opens the door to much bigger questions about how we structure our economy and what its purpose is, really. You know, so some have suggested in the context of the deficit debate that the goal of growth should be replaced by the goal of creating jobs. Further consideration here is climate change, which, to put it mildly, is a huge problem that we're not doing anywhere near enough. And I hope that Corbynomics, even though it's not worked out, opens the door to seriously engaging with these issues and placing them at the centre of our economic policy. Amen.